It's truly a pleasure to be here. As Kat said, my name is Sharon Heaton, and I am the CEO and founder of SB Liftoff. SB Liftoff is a national M&A advisory firm. What I'm really here to talk about is talking about trust in M&A. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to build trust as a deal proceeds. But first, let's talk a little bit about why. Why is trust something that an M&A advisor should even care about? And here's the reason why. Depth of trust between the M&A advisor and the client definitely makes the deal go better. Depth of trust between the seller and the buyer make a deal more stable. Depth of trust can help us avoid the two things that are real deal killers: time and surprises. How can you be more efficient and take less time to close a deal? Well, trust can help. How can you make sure that there's no unpleasant surprises that kill a deal? Again, trust matters. The answer is building trust between the important actors in the transaction. If money is the fuel that pushes the party forward to get a deal done, trust is like the oil in the car, making everything else work more smoothly so the car can speed forward to its destination on time without any surprising engine trouble. So that's kind of why we're talking about trust. I'm talking about trust in the context of M&A is the last art of finance. And it's the last art of finance because there's so many people and emotions involved. At the AMAA convention, I talked about the heart of the deal. And the heart of the deal really is about emotions generally. But here, we're going to be talking specifically about the emotion of trust, and in fact, places where trust is warranted and where it's not. So let's go to next slide. In this context, I want to focus on a particular kind of seller. I want to focus on the business owner, usually a founder, but not always, who's been running their company for 5, 10, 20 years. This owner is emotionally committed to their company. They may have a lot of experience in running their company and growing their company, but probably have very little experience in M&A. The lack of experience, plus the awareness that this is likely to be the largest financial transaction of their life, causes tremendous anxiety and stress in that seller. So figuring out what you as the M&A advisor or the lawyer or the accountant can do to really, as we put it, holding the founder owner's hand is hugely important in making sure that that deal is stable and can get over the finish line. As I said, many founder owners find M&A to be confusing. We use lots of language that they've never heard before, and this lack of experience leads to that increased anxiety. Add to that the emotions attached to the company and the separation anxiety associated with leaving it is really very challenging. So creating that relationship with the founder owner is critically important. We like to think about it as that you are building trust over time with the client. The first phase is preparation. Really, the first phase is before they actually even sign a listing agreement. I had a client a couple of years ago that we had been working with for a while, and finally he signed a listing agreement. As he signed the listing agreement, I was getting ready to walk out the door. He turned to me and said, "Sharon, I have 100% confidence that you can handle this M&A transaction. However, what are you going to do about my emotional sanity?" And I laughed and I said, "That's approximately 50% of our job, keeping you in your seat, keeping you understanding, and keeping you calm." So the first thing that needs to be done in the preparation is preparing the relationship between the M&A advisor and the client. And for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to assume the client is on the sell side. Trust is a very different issue on the buy side. So we're going to deal with the one that's a little more existential, which is the sell side. And it's very important to talk to that seller about a variety of issues. Obviously, what's going on with the company, what are their goals, how long are they willing to transition, all of those kinds of important issues related to the company. But it's really important that you listen and understand their family and life concerns. Why are they selling? Is there a health issue? Is there a health issue with somebody else in the family? Have they just decided that they're done? Do they want to continue to work for a while? What are their plans after the transaction? Do they have any? Before I understood the importance of these issues, I worked on one transaction, and the owner was a little bit older. He was in his 80s, and he was hesitant to sell his company, but knew that he had to. There were some health issues involved. So we went through the process, and we got a letter of intent, and we got it at a good purchase price. And then the seller came in and blew up the deal. And when I asked him afterwards, why did you do that? He said, because I really didn't know what I was going to do with myself if I didn't have the company. That's something that was my mistake. I should have understood his level of existential angst for selling the company and either not brought it to market or tried to deal with that before bringing it to market. We're not going to make that mistake again. But it's really important that the seller has thought through what are they going to be doing with their life, because again, there are two parties to this, not just the buyer and the seller, but the seller and the M&A advisor. And we need to understand what they're thinking about. We need to be listening to what their fears are, their dreams. And a time to start creating trust is at this point, because many sellers will say to us, I want to find a buyer that's going to run the company just like I will. And that seller is going to be disappointed if you tell them that that's what you're going to do. No buyer is going to run the company in exactly the same way that the seller did. And so part of building trust this early in the process is telling the seller the truth, telling them that in fact, a buyer is going to do it differently. It may be better, it may be worse, but it won't be the same. So bizarrely enough, one of the ways to build trust with a client is to tell them things that they don't want to hear. If you only tell them things that they want to hear, it feels good, but it doesn't necessarily build that trust. If you say to them, I hear what you want, but that may not be something that can be delivered, that's more credibility than saying, I can deliver whatever your dreams are. So that buyer, that seller really needs to be doing a kind of self-assessment, both about their company as well as themselves. It's very important because I was giving a presentation at one point with a very well-regarded commercial banker. And I was, of course, talking about M&A. He was talking about M&A financing. And he said, these deals are easy. It all just comes down to the numbers. And I couldn't help myself, but I started to laugh because to me, it felt like he was only seeing a third of what was going on. That there's a huge amount that goes on in these transactions unrelated to those numbers. And numbers don't need trust in the same way that people do who are giving you advice. So that first issue of creating it is very important. In part two, when you are now going out and trying to find buyers, one of the most important issues for a lot of sellers is maintaining confidentiality. And so the job of an M&A advisor is to figure out who we can trust to share information with that will not then do damage to that client. So again, that whole issue of trust. Trust, however, must be earned. It cannot simply be given away. At one point, we were working with a company that had decided that she didn't need an M&A advisor. She decided that she could sell her company herself and picked up the phone and called her three biggest competitors and said, by the way, I want to sell my company. I'm happy to share my financials. How much will you pay me for this? Well, that was a trust that she should not have extended. Trusting your competitors in a situation like this is very dangerous, and it worked out very badly for her. In fact, those three competitors each gave her an offer for her company, but a fraction of what it was worth. Then they started rating her employees, basically saying, do you know that your owner wants to sell? You know, you should jump to me before there's a sale and who knows what's going to happen. So she lost a lot of her staff. And then these competitors had similar customers. So the competitors reached out to the customers and said, you really should be working with us because we're long-term stable, and that's not necessarily true for other parties. So one of the things about trust is figuring out who to trust with what and who not to trust ever. And one of those things is you really should not be sharing information with your competitors. That becomes very important if, in fact, you're working on a strategic transaction. Because in a strategic transaction, chances are the seller is going to be talking to potential buyers that are in the same industry or are competitors. Now, you could trust them, but you're going to be revealing a lot of information. And if that deal doesn't close, you've now shared all that information. Is that trust that's smart or not? You really need to know who it is you're dealing with. So that maintaining confidentiality is incredibly important. So we get into this second part and due diligence. Now, we all know about due diligence, but due diligence is actually, to some extent, an exercise in trust. The seller has told the buyer all sorts of things, but due diligence is the buyer verifying if that's correct. As we all know, Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. That's kind of what an M&A transaction is when there's good due diligence going on. That due diligence is the verification process. Now, part of that for the seller is that the seller absolutely must have full transparency. First, with their M&A advisor, and second, with the buyer. What do I mean by that? For full transparency, as an M&A advisor, when we're looking at a company, we're trying to look at it like a third party. What's a buyer going to see that seems unusual? Well, we were working on one transaction where the seller, our client, had their net working capital increasing hugely every month. It went from in 1 year being about $2 million, and then a couple of years later, it was like $10 million. That was a huge net working capital. And I was saying, does that make any sense? So I went to my client and I said, I'm really concerned about the net working capital. It looks to me like you are giving loans to your vendor, or you're giving payments to your vendor that you've not yet received from your client. So you're making loans. Why are you doing this? This seems like a bad idea, and it seems like something a buyer is not going to like. And my client turned to me and said, Sharon, you don't understand. Our clients are Fortune 1000 companies. We're going to get paid. It's going to take 90 days. We never have bad AR. We always get paid. Our vendors, however, typically are two guys in a truck, and they need to get paid quickly in order to pay their mortgage, pay their car payments, put food on the table. So we basically make sure that we pay our vendors within 30 days, even though it takes us 90 days to get our clients to pay us. And I said, but why do you do that? They said, because these vendors will drop anything to come work for us. They trust us that we will pay them, and that they know that they will drop other jobs to work for us. As a result of the transparency involved in that, we put that into the SIM. And when we were talking to buyers, we talked to them right up front. Hey, the net working capital is really quite large, but really, that's an asset because we have the loyalty of our vendors. And as a result, no buyer made that an issue, and that became a non-issue. Very, very important. Another issue that comes up in terms of transparency is that sometimes sellers will want to withhold a problem with the company. We don't need to tell them that pretty LOI. Maybe they'll never even find it out. Well, we, as we're building trust with our sellers, tell them, do not do that. If there is a challenge, and there will always be a challenge, you've got to make sure that you're sharing that with with your buyer. And I've had clients ask why. And the answer is the likelihood of that not being found is very, very small. First of all, it's likely to be found before closing. And second is if it's found after closing, you've got reps and warranties. So you're responsible for it anyway. But let's say you were able to get to the letter of intent without disclosing something. After the LOI, when the buyer is doing the due diligence and finds it, they're going to think one of two things. Either one, the seller didn't know about this problem, and hence they don't necessarily know what's going on in their company. That means that this is a much riskier transaction than I thought it was. Or, worse yet, the buyer will think that the seller knew about it, but decided not to disclose it, which means that the buyer can't trust the buyer. The buyer can't trust the seller. That's a very bad situation to be in. On the day of closing, the buyer will always know less about the company than the seller does. The seller wakes up in the morning knowing more than what the buyer has been spending months doing due diligence on. So the buyer is looking to the seller to say, is this a trustworthy party? Is this somebody who is trying to get me to step into their shoes because they know of a problem that they haven't told me about? That transparency is incredibly important. The flip side is also important, which is buyers will be asking very hard questions of the seller. Some sellers get offended by that. They don't understand why the buyer can't simply look at the financials and say, but we've got this margin, we've been profitable for these years, just buy the company. Buyers need to know why, sellers need not to be offended, and sellers need to trust that the buyers are asking what it is they really need to be. One of the other issues on trust that comes up at this point is what to do about key employees. Very often we're working with uh, an individual, maybe it's a couple, and they want to be the only ones who know that there's a possible transaction. But they may not be the people who are controlling the finances. So there's a lot of due diligence requests that are necessary, both in the preparation stage as well as the stage when you're actually talking with potential buyers. And it's awkward if, in fact, the owners can't access that information. So very often, owners will bring one or two people into the process early. So they should be thinking about who are the key employees to bring in to the loop of what's going on from an M&A transaction and when. It doesn't necessarily need to be at the very beginning, but as the process continues, there probably are some people that need to be brought in. I was dealing with one situation where there was a husband and wife who owned a company, and the husband's father was an employee. Um, they had been keeping the transaction quiet, telling nobody. We got to an LOI, and I suggested to the couple that they inform their father that there was going to be a transaction. And they were nervous about it. And I said, "Is there some awkwardness in the relationship with the father?" And said, "No, we just don't want to tell anybody." I raised it a couple of times, and ultimately they did tell the father. My concern was that if they did not share this information, there was going to be a long-term strain on the relationship because they were essentially saying they didn't trust the father. Not a good place to be from a business perspective or from a personal perspective. So that buyer stage is very important. That's when not only have you had to create the relationship between the M&A advisor and the seller, but now you're starting to create the relationship between the seller, the buyer, employees, and others. Um, then phase three, of course, is letter of intent to closing. And that is when the clown car of everybody gets involved in these transactions. So, for instance, the LOI is a 5 or 6 page document. The purchase agreement could be a 60 or an 80-page document, and it's one document of many. So there needs to be a lot of openness and trust between the buyer and the seller. When the buyer sees a problem, they need to have the confidence to be able to raise their hand and ask the seller as to what's going on here, as opposed to simply running off and saying, "Oh my God, I found a problem. This is devastating. We're done." In addition, and I'd like to say that this never happens, but it usually does, there are some last minute negotiations that will occur. Not necessarily to purchase price, it could be to reps and warranties, it could be to networking capital, but there'll be something. Um, we'd like to tell our sellers that the price that you're going to get on your letter of intent is the highest price you're going to see. And our goal is to settle that deal, is to close that deal with you getting approximately 97% of what that purchase price is. There may be some carve outs for things like um, paid time off, or revenue recognition issues, or a variety of things. But you should be getting a very, very high percentage of whatever that value is on the LOI. That's where those last minute negotiations and price adjustments come in. Sellers are often very concerned that the buyer is just stringing them along until the last moment, at which time they're going to say, well, we'll close this deal next week, but only if you cut your purchase price by 25%. Buyers really need to indicate whether or not that they're that kind of person, and whether or not they're going to be looking for some type of negotiated advantage in an unpleasant way at the very end. So let's talk about the trust building between the seller and the buyer. They each have their own responsibilities. Both the seller and the buyer are working on a variety of things. The seller is working on their own company, and they're working on the M&A. The buyer might be working on their own company, and they're working on the M&A with the seller, and they're likely working on a financing transaction with a bank of some sort. So it's incredibly important that there be some level of empathy between the buyer, who understands that the seller is going through all of these both emotional and financial issues, and the seller, who says, why isn't the buyer being faster in responding to these things? Because the buyer is working on so many different things simultaneously. It's really important that they both be truthful and transparent. They have to openly share the strengths and weaknesses of the company. And for sellers, it's really important to recognize that every company has strengths. And gosh knows, we want to identify those strengths and promote them and really make sure the buyer understands. But every company has challenges as well. Every company has challenges. And the idea is to be honest about those challenges. We were dealing with one transaction where the seller was selling a product to their client, and they had 5 equal billing periods. So they were getting their payments 20% of revenue at 5 separate times. For the first billing milestone, very little work was done, very little work. And for the second milestone, just a slight amount more. So the seller was getting about 40% of their revenue for doing very little of the actual work. We came in and looked at their financials and said, this is a revenue recognition issue. This is not how GAAP works. And you're taking money into revenue that in fact is cash with a countervailing liability, and you're not putting that liability on your balance sheet. So your EBITDA is a little bit overstated because you're counting things as profit that really should not be. We discussed it with the client, and he said he did not want to change his financials, but we insisted that we have to tell buyers that we are not meeting revenue recognition policies. We did that, did a full disclosure, found a buyer, got to a letter of intent, and had a purchase price. After the letter of intent, the buyer, of course, does a quality of earnings. Not surprisingly, the accountant's hair go on fire, and he says, "Oh my God, these are wrong revenue recognition. The EBITDA is overstated." The buyer comes back to us and says, "My accountants say the EBITDA is overstated. We need to readjust the deal. We're going to do a downward price adjustment." And we said to the buyer, "No, we told you about this in advance. We disclosed it. We told you how this was working. You understood it. You went forward into the LOI. You are absolutely free not to go forward with the transaction. But then you're not going forward with the transaction for something that you knew about before you signed the LOI. However, if you want to go forward, we're happy to go forward under the transaction that we agreed to." And ultimately, the buyer went forward, in part because it had been disclosed appropriately. Had it not been, there would have been a very significant price renegotiation. So the seller openly sharing strengths and weaknesses, saying, "We are not GAAP compliant," may not feel like the best thing to say. But in the circumstance I just gave you, it really was very important. The other is providing access to all data. Buyers get to see whatever the heck it is they want. Now, they don't get to see it all up front. That is Sometimes we will withhold the names of the employees. We will provide a census of the age and the salaries and the job description, but not necessarily the names, particularly if it's a strategic deal, because we don't want to provide that information in a way that could be damaging to the seller. But ultimately, that buyer's not going to close that deal without finding out the names of those people. And a seller is not in a situation to say no. Um, and I will tell you that after the deal closes. Um, Buyers and sellers should be open with each other for explaining their real motivations for doing the transaction. If buyers think that the seller are going off into retirement, and then in fact they take some other very drastically different step, that will make the buyer very concerned. That will make the buyer feel like, well, wait a minute, this seller might be having a problem and trying to dump it off on me. Buyers should also share information regarding their financing. How much equity they're bringing to the table. What level of debt are they going to need? Because when we're negotiating the LOI, certainly the seller has a right to know that. If the buyer is saying, yes, I will buy this company under these terms, but I need to get 95% debt financing, 2024, that's not going to happen. So that's important information to the seller. And buyers are often loath to share that, but they really do need to. Another thing, and this is extremely important for all the parties, is providing an accurate timetable to close. If a buyer says to a seller, we will turn around the document by Tuesday, and it's now a week later and they don't have it, that deteriorates trust. If they say they're going to do something and do it, that builds trust. And that trust building is where there's a successful transaction. Now we're going to talk about due diligence norms. And due diligence, while it's critically important, is in fact just a trust situation. It is the buyer saying, you've told me the following revenue, the following margins, the following contracts, etc. Um, Due diligence is the trust but verify moment. And sellers can sometimes get a little out of whack about that, but it's pretty important that they understand that this is what the buyer is doing to make sure that they are trusting but verifying. And while it can feel invasive, it's really important to operate under good faith and transparency. Transparency and access, also incredibly important. The buyer and the seller are going to be sharing a lot of information, and that's going to be pretty important if the buyer is in fact a strategic. Again, you've got to know who it is you're dealing with. As said before, the seller should continue to operate the business as the way in which they would normally operate it. They should not start taking strange steps that would be detrimental to the buyer. So one thing that I've seen in the past is sellers basically saying, well, wait a minute, I get to keep the cash on the balance sheet, but I don't get to keep my AR. So sellers will sometimes take steps to try and convert their AR into cash at an accelerated rate just prior to closing. First of all, it doesn't build trust. And second of all, the net working capital target will prevent you from doing so. But you will have just shown yourself as somebody who's trying to work the system to your advantage to somebody else's disadvantage. You should really run the company in the same way that you have. Another issue, and we talked about this slightly before, is informing employees. Very early on, most sellers inform very few employees, if any. Around the time of the LOI, maybe one or two more get brought in. During the LOI to closing phase, another handful might get brought in, but most employees would not know until the deal actually closes. We did a transaction a year or two ago, and I was telling my selling client, please be very careful. Do not share this information with your employees unless there's a specific need to know. Apparently, I was not clear enough because when we signed the letter of intent, she called all the employees into their large conference room and announced that the company was going to be sold. Well, as everybody on this phone knows, signing an LOI doesn't mean that that deal is going to close. It happened and that one did. But by telling the employees so quickly, employees will ask all the same questions. They ask, am I going to lose my job? Is my salary going to get cut? Are my benefits going to be reduced? And the answer to those questions, the best that we could answer was no to all of them. You're not going to lose your job, but we can't talk for the buyer. Those would be questions that would come up later in the process after there had been more discussions, and there could be some more prep work around that messaging. So informing employees may feel like an issue of trust for the seller, but you've got to be very careful as to who you bring into that into the circle of knowing. So you have to figure out when you're going to trust which employees to bring them into the M&A process. Okay, so that is kind of the presentation. This is pretty interesting. As some of you may know, I wrote a book that came out earlier this year, and we're giving it away for anybody who's interested in seeing it. But one of the things that I did in this book that I think was really trust inducing was do each chapter as a question. What is the question that we tend to hear from our sellers? And then answering that question in as much detail with as least jargon as we possibly can. That is, it's showing the seller that we understand what their concerns are and responding to them before there's a problem. And that's very much how we go about trying to build that trust. We know that there's going to be an issue with net working capital. I've yet to find the seller who understands why we're leaving net working capital or how it gets calculated. I've yet to see the buyer who simply signs on to every EBITDA adjustment that we do on the sell side. We need to be very transparent with both those buyers and the sellers so that they can know that what's happening is fair and that they expected it. How do you maintain confidentiality? What do I look for in a sellable deal? In some ways, it's very challenging to turn to sellers and say anything other than your company is fantastic. Uh, the way in which you build trust is by, in fact, saying to them, your company's fantastic. It really is wonderful what you've been able to accomplish here. But it doesn't mean it's without challenges. And we need to own those challenges so that we can really take an appropriate step. Trust between the buyer and the seller, I think, is probably the most important currency in doing one of these transactions, particularly if it's going to have any level of structuring so that the seller is going to either have a seller financing, equity rollover, or some type of earnout. The buyer is trusting the seller that when they buy the company, they're getting the company that they think that they're going to be getting. The seller is trusting the buyer that they're going to do well with their legacy, that they're going to pay off the future consideration. So this trust between the buyer and the seller is incredibly important. We spend time trying to build the trust between the buyer and the seller and really work that relationship so that it's strong. I would be curious to see if anybody has any comments about things that they do to try and to try and build relationship between the buyer and the seller.
Yeah.
We've often found that buyers that we know well walk in with a little bit more of a halo effect than for buyers that we don't know because the seller already has some level of trust in us. But I find it very interesting that 100% of the people who responded to this said the deal succeeded because there was trust between the buyer and the seller.
What about the clients with said existential crisis that you mentioned in the beginning? Is there any path forward on those potential deals?
Um, I find that allowing them to have the existential crisis, well, there's two ways of dealing with it. First is try and trigger the crisis before you go to market. Really have them think that through, live, what will it feel like? Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm dealing with a situation right now where, again, it's a seller. It's a little bit on the older side. It has some health issues. We brought his company to market. We got, some pretty good deals on it. We finished the negotiation of the LOI. And then after the weekend, the seller called us and said, I just don't think I can do it. What we did in that case, and this is not the best, we basically said, we understand. We pulled the plug on the transaction, and I gave him 2 or 3 months. And after 3 months, I called him again and opened the dialogue. This seller is incredibly eager to sell because he now understands that pulling back the deal from the market was not what was in his best interest. Unfortunately, as I said, he's a little bit older with some health issues. He actually fell down a flight of stairs. And he fell down a flight of stairs while he still owns this company and is running it on a daily basis. And it just was the issue that he was trying to avoid. So unfortunately, he had to live the existential crisis and will be bringing his company back to market. It's not desirable for us because essentially it's two transactions as opposed to one. On the other hand, that's the process that this particular seller needed to go through. Keeping a deal stable and on track isn't easy. Among the tools we have in our toolkit for taking a deal to the finish line is using trust as a way of building confidence, building transparency, and avoiding the sinks and the surprises that can occur in these deals. Human brains are actually wired to fear. Scientists can actually measure when a chemical in the brain shows that trust is present. Trust is a real thing. But as we know, building trust is difficult, it takes time, it takes consistency, and it must be earned. You cannot, as an M&A advisor, just walk up to somebody and say, trust me. You need to actually show how you're putting their interests before your interests. It takes honesty and it takes a level of empathy. It takes a level of empathy for us whose business it is to whose business is the business of transferring companies, to understand that that's not what our seller's business is, and we need to be empathetic to what it is they're feeling. We can try as M&A advisors to wish that M&A deals were simply financial transactions, but they're not. There's a lot of emotions, and sometimes those emotions can make people a little on the crazy side. But you can't wish away the crazy. We've got to manage it. Our clients will bring their humanity into the deal. And we need to bring our humanity into the services that we're providing. The reality is this: deals, especially in this lower mid market, involve human beings, business owners, and they all have emotions. Building a depth of trust with our clients and between buyers and sellers will ensure greater stability for the deal and increase the likelihood that that deal is going to close.